Our world is a very beautiful place, but so often we humans mess it up. In this series of presentations, we're looking at the area of persecution. And this is the second presentation in the series. Persecution. Let's remember what Jesus said. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who are before you. And later he goes on to say, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belonged to the world, it would love you as its own. Remember what I told you. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. The way of Jesus is a way which is in conflict with the cultures of our day, indeed of every day. And Jesus points out that persecution is inevitable. I want to look back at the history of persecution. But in doing this, I want to remind you that, in fact, in today's society, our media largely ignore the facts. And there are major gaps in the interpretation of what is actually happening. I would go far as to say it's a misrepresentation of what's going on. I'm puzzled by it. I can't find any simple logical explanation for it. Facts, not because I accept them or I've invented them, but facts that are widely documented, for which there is a huge amount of evidence. But let's look at what history actually says. All of this is based on confirmed evidence. Much of it coming from secular organizations which have no apparent axe to grind at all, but simply reporting the facts, and yet somehow they don't seem to get through to our media. In many countries today, there is no equality, and there is no equality before the law. Indeed, when followers of Jesus register a complaint against some violence, there is police indifference. Action is often not taken. In many countries today, there is unjust imprisonment, trumped-up charges that could simply not be true. And in many countries there is torture, even in some Western countries. While in some countries people die in prison, in peculiar and suspicious circumstances, and there are many people who just vanish. They're eliminated. And sometimes whole groups are eliminated. In many countries today there is intimidation of the followers of Jesus. Some of them deny education, and there's a loss of livelihood. So, for example, in some Islamic states, without the pass in the Islamic exam, you won't get access to higher education. Those who are not Muslims have a disadvantage. In some Islamic countries, businesses run by non-Muslims are boycotted till they go bankrupt. And it's pointed out to them, oh, we'll all come back if you become a Muslim. Property is lost. Homes are destroyed. Buildings are just bulldozed. And there is no freedom of worship. Indeed, in Saudi Arabia, they invest billions in mosque building overseas. But no other religious group is allowed to build a temple or a church or even to meet together unofficially inside the borders of Saudi Arabia. there is no freedom of worship. And we've seen the tragedies, increasingly so in the modern era, where there's a policy of just simply exterminating, killing the men. Rape the women, then they become the possession of the conquerors. The children are enslaved. And whole ethnic and religious groups are wiped out. And this is largely targeted against the followers of Jesus, though not entirely so. This is what is happening in our world today, tragically. Let's go back in time now. What happened if we go back far enough? Do you remember the story? Surrounding the birth of Moses, Pharaoh tried to kill all the Jewish boys. He wanted to reduce the threat of the Israeli people group who were multiplying too fast. King Ahab tried to silence Elijah, and God protected him, because Elijah stood for integrity in seeking God. That was his crime. Many prophets suffered, but let me just mention Jeremiah. The leadership of his day, the religious leadership as well as the political leadership, they tried to silence him because the leadership had become totally corrupted and were self-serving. And the story of the book of Esther. A policy of extermination of the Jews. Wipe out the people of God totally. Then we can do what we like. When Jesus was born, Herod saw a threat. And so there's a plan by Herod to exterminate all the infant boys. Probably only maybe 20. But think of 20 mothers bereft of their child. Because this would destroy the plan of God for humanity. There was a determination to get rid of Jesus. Bringing it together in these early records, you see individuals or religious leaders or political leaders, they found God's people a threat to their own vested interests. Vested interest is always at the source of this. So they aim to reduce the threat or just to exterminate it by exterminating people. People are expendable. And how sad that has been down through history. What about the life of Jesus himself? We saw how Herod tried to kill Jesus in infancy. Went back to his hometown, confronting the synagogue leaders. They had this cozy Jew-centered system. They didn't want it disturbed. Jesus disturbed it, so they wanted to kill him. When Jesus was healing, he was accused of being in league with Satan, because you see, the healings of Jesus, wonderful miracles, they challenged the religious power base of the Pharisees. And when he went to Jerusalem, they wanted to stone him, because Jesus confronted, by his very lifestyle, he confronted their religious power, their cozy religious power, their vested interests. And the religious leadership and the political leadership combined, and they executed Jesus in torture on a Roman cross, exterminating those who disturbed the power bases. Jesus, by his very life, by the quality of his life, he challenged the power base of religious leadership. His authority, his teaching, he liberated people to be people. He released people to their true humanity and his very nature of purity and holiness. So they eliminated him. What about the early church? Stephen was stoned because the religious leadership were challenged. Saul systematically hounded the followers of Jesus, because Saul saw himself as defending the cozy Jewish religious system. The apostles were threatened. Peter was imprisoned. James was killed. Intimidation. Kill one. Frighten the rest. Silence the message. It's disturbing our cozy power base. And Paul, as the follower of Jesus, a long history of being imprisoned, beaten, street riots surrounding him. He was stoned, and then eventually he was executed. all part of silencing the great intellectual leader of the people of God of that day, Paul, the intellectual giant. And then under various Roman emperors who claimed divinity, there was extreme persecution, attempts to simply wipe out the followers of Jesus. The power base of Rome, the religious power base of worshipping an emperor, that was threatened. The people of God were living quiet lives, but they would not worship a Caesar. So they were tortured, persecuted. And the more they were persecuted, the more they grew. Because the followers of Jesus were doing just what Jesus had done. Just simply by being there, by living lives of quality. They challenged the power base of religious leadership and political leadership. The followers of Jesus had authority. There was healings, there were miracles. Their teaching brought purity and holiness. Their sheer life quality, in many cases, challenged the whole society of the day. So they were persecuted. And then we went into long and dark days in the history of the church. The Roman Empire took on Christianity, and human leadership of the church combined with political human leadership. And it started building its power base in Rome and spreading that power throughout the then Roman Empire. And the way of Jesus was being destroyed. Jumping forward many hundreds of years, the tragic events of the Crusades. We followers of Jesus should be ashamed of what was done in the name of Jesus. Although history shows that much was done in the name of trade routes and money and wealth. But Jews and Muslims were brutally treated. And that was to take land back, to get trade routes back, to control money, to keep the leadership in Rome well oiled with money and resources. Yes, we have to accept that they were taking back land that Muslims had taken from them in centuries before. But that's never the way of Jesus. And it certainly never is the way of Jesus to massacre brutally other people. And all over Europe, over several centuries, Catholic mobs, often with Vatican support, Jews were killed. And the social ills of the societies of the day were heaped on the ethnic group called Jews. Then, before the Reformation, those who tried to translate the Bible from the original languages into the vernacular of the day were often tortured and burned at the stake. Because, you see, access to the Bible was going to destroy the power base of the religion, which had become corrupted. And as Roman Catholicism spread, carried on by the great exciting journeys of explorers, people in South America and indeed in the Far East, they were forced to convert at the edge of a sword. Human leadership forced its belief system on others. That's never the way of Jesus. These were dark days. And we should be ashamed of them, even today. It all comes back to that. It's true in any age, at any time, in any group, anywhere. You see, religious leadership, or any leadership, is so easily corrupted by a love of power, a love of money, and the desire to control other people and be seen to be important. You can see it today, all over the world. But it was particularly bad in the dark days. What about the time of the Reformation? The Muslims had come from Africa and had settled and taken over much of the area of Spain and Portugal. The retaliation was the Spanish Inquisition, violent suppression of dissent. You see, an enforced conformity to protect religious power bases. That's always the way. We saw how the early reformers, Bible translators, threatened, imprisoned, tortured, killed, because the official church structure, there's a fear of loss of control. Its power base, its money, was going to be lost. And then those who had broken away start to retaliate. Oh, how tragic it is that we try to force conformity on other people. And this went on. And you can see it very vividly in the history of Germany, where you've got Catholic Länder and Protestant Länder, although much broken up today. Because you see, religion likes its power base. It likes to enforce its system on the people under its power, and it often combines with politics to do it. Again, we should be ashamed of what has gone on. And so those churches that aligned themselves with political structures started to persecute those churches that were more independent, broadly in the Baptist, Congregational and Pentecostal areas. Again, this enforced conformity, all back to protect a religious power base. A religious conformity is enforced. That has so often been the tragic history of the people of God. Corrupted. And it all goes back to people wanting power bases. People in leadership, people combining religious leadership with political leadership. Jesus made it clear it should never be that way. And again, we need to turn away in shame at so much that happened. Bringing it nearer to our time. In both Nazism and communism, there was a ruthless suppression of all dissent. It coupled to a strong anti-Semitism. Jewish populations suffered horrendously. There was a distortion of religion, a misrepresentation. There was this view of some kind of racial purity. And the whole idea of equality of humanity was lost. And a kind of ruling ethnic group, whether it's the Aryan population seen in Nazism or the ruling communist leadership as seen in communism, they were protected, they had their power base, they had influence, and the rabble suffered. And under Nazism, millions were exterminated. Life itself was devalued. There was no equality, and that always means a destruction of minorities. And that is still happening today in many cultures and societies where non-equality of people is taught. And that always means that minorities go to the wall. And under both these systems, millions were killed in combat. Because they saw violence as a way to gain more power, resources, control. Violence to get land, violence to get money, violence to get control. And there was deliberate starvation and the terrible labor camps under Stalin, who alone probably was responsible for more deaths than any other single human being in the history of humanity. He was utterly insecure. So any perceived threat, he started policies of extermination. The suffering in Eastern Europe was unbelievably awful. And under Mao Zedong in China, utterly irrational policies. And many, many people suffered and died at the hands of these policies. The people of God suffered in these situations, particularly. This is political conformity gone mad. And it all goes back to protecting the power bases of those in political leadership. You can still see that today. Indeed, in the West, there's elements of it in our political ruling class and the kind of laws they seek to impose. What about genocides? There are many genocides. I've picked 5 that illustrate the worst abuses in terms of sheer numbers. Right throughout the Nazi-ruled countries, 75% of all the Jews who lived there were exterminated because the ruling elite demanded a racial purity. We are all equal before God. God loves all humanity. There is no racial superiority. There is no religious superiority. There is no ruling class as of right. Let's go back and look at the teaching of Jesus. The Cambodian Pol Pot regime, it is estimated, and this may be an underestimate, that 2 million people who were seen as opponents were simply exterminated, the killing fields of Cambodia. And people who were intellectuals, people who were religious leaders, people of a different ethnic group, they suffered the worst. And the followers of Jesus were part of this. The Turks may deny it, but the historical evidence is absolutely clear. The former Ottoman Empire, it deliberately by policy destroyed 1 million Armenians and 1 million Assyrians and Greeks. These are probably underestimates. And if you look at the documentation, it was a deliberate policy of extermination of those who were not Muslims by the Muslim majority. Where is that in our media today? The wars in Congo. Between 1 and 3 million, difficult to know numbers. Records are not good there. They were exterminated simply on racial grounds. They belonged to the wrong tribe. Racial competition for land and resources. Horrendous suffering. And the Rwandan genocides. Again back to racial grounds. 0.8 of a million were simply exterminated. A ruling class of one ethnic group sought to destroy an alternative ethnic group. And here was the use of rape as a weapon of war. Kill the men, rape the women. And as a result, tens of thousands of women in that land today contracted HIV/AIDS. These are horrendous stories. There are many others, but I picked the ones that have particularly big numbers. And it comes back to that. Any ruling elite, or any religious ruling elite, when it sees itself or its religion as superior, then it will start to eliminate, and it will use violent means, to eliminate any and every group that it sees as a challenge, to protect its own position of superiority and power, money and status. And tragically, that is still going on today. Persecutions. God's people have suffered amidst this. Don't think I'm being biased. The evidence from independent organizations confirmed all over the world is that in persecution today in the world in the last decades, 80% is directed against Christians. Tragically, you don't hear that in the media. The picture that's often presented is the reverse. But 80% is against the followers of Jesus. So we have to focus on the followers of Jesus. We have suffered far worse than any other group, political or religious. So let's look at modern persecution today. In strongly Islamic states, there are no freedoms for those who are not Muslims. They're regarded as second-class citizens because the Quran teaches that. God does not love the non-Muslims. There is no equality under the law. That's built into Sharia law. So if a non-Muslim complains before the law and the Muslim denies the accusation, the Muslim always wins because he carries more weight under the law. And there are vast numbers suffering because of this Islamic insecurity. In the communist countries, not so many of them left. Again, there's this loss of freedom. People are in prison, tortured, and die. And the followers of Jesus suffer particularly, both in Islamic persecution and communist persecution. North Korea today. Christians are being eliminated, tortured to death on a regular basis. But the amazing thing is this. There is a growth in the numbers of followers of Jesus in Islamic lands and communist lands. And that has always been the history down through the centuries. Persecute the followers of Jesus, more people join them all the time. Hindu persecution of the followers of Jesus, a violence against those who leave Hindus. They're losing their power. The lower classes in India today, they're leaving Hinduism because they find the liberty and the freedom in the way of Jesus. They're being treated with brutality and violence. Indeed, in the world today, Hinduism is losing numbers rapidly. Buddhists sometimes get involved. Violence against any non-Buddhist. Sometimes we look at our media, we think the Buddhists are suffering, and sometimes they do. But in fact, if you look at the evidence, they cause far more persecution than they suffer. And again, they're losing numbers. And throughout the world, there are strong anti-religious agendas, and you see it among some ruling elites. It sometimes surfaces in various parliaments and legislatures. So people are slipping in little laws that are actually quite anti-biblical, making life more difficult in the West for those who are following Jesus, some of whom have lost livelihoods and gone through court cases and then had the indignity of not only losing the case when they shouldn't have, but then left to pay the bill for the lawyers. And then in South America, the followers of Jesus, the leaders there, are so often resisting those who are running drug campaigns and cartels. So the drugs barons just eliminate the religious leaders or whoever it is that is causing the resistance, the ordinary followers of Jesus, because they want their power base. They want to exploit other people to make money. That's what's going on in the world today. And 80% of the persecution is directed against those who are followers of Jesus, not the reverse, as sometimes you might get the impression from the way our media present it. That is simply a fact. If you get the figures from the whole world, it's not true in the Western world, but the rest of the world, the followers of Jesus, the numbers are growing rapidly. Therefore, other religions and other political stances feel threatened. That's one source of persecution. The other source is that the followers of Jesus are offering resisting the abuses of power, the abuses of money, and exploitation of people. They stand against slavery. They stand against the trade of people being moved around. They stand against the sex trade. Big things making a lot of money in the world. They stand against the drug trade. The followers of Jesus often pay the penalty for that. And in our so-called civilized West, social laws are being passed that are undermining the family and society. And the people of Jesus are resisting that. And we're being accused of all sorts of things, just as Jesus predicted we would be. Not a good picture. What about others? We focused on the 80%. The Jewish people have always been resented in polytheistic environments or atheistic or agnostic environments. Under the Romans, they were brutally treated. Well, they were arrogant and they were rebellious. The Romans treated them horrendously. And then tragically, down through the centuries, some Christians started to point the finger at the Jews because they claimed they killed Jesus. No, they didn't kill Jesus. Some religious leaders at the time of Jesus arranged for Jesus to be killed, not the Jewish people. And Nazi and communist policies sought to exterminate the Jewish people. They had too much power, too much financial power. And in Islamic lands and throughout the world, Jews are vilified by Muslims. The language of the Quran is horrendous. The Jews are called for everything. But also, there is an anger by the Muslims against the Jews because of modern Israel and its behavior. Indeed, the very existence of modern Israel. What about Islam? Historically, Islam has been involved in an enormous amount of warfare and strife. Muslims were brutally treated when the crusading armies entered Jerusalem. The Spanish brutalities. Now, to be fair, they followed the Islamic incursions from Africa, but that doesn't justify what happened. In the Balkans, 3 ethnic groups collided. The Ottoman Empire was expanding upwards and westwards. Eastern Europe was losing as it came from the northeast, and Western Europe from the west and the northwest, they collided, and there was ethnic group wars there. And as the Muslims expanded eastwards, they bumped into the other religions of the East and eventually into the communism of China and related states. Treated badly. In the Indian subcontinent, the Muslims and the Hindus, competition. And in the former communist states, the southern Russian states, Muslims are often treated very badly. And many of these states have now got their freedom. And tragically, the Muslims who now run these countries are treating minorities with the same lack of freedom. And the Serbian genocide, where Eastern Europe collided with Islam, a recent event. The media make a lot of this, and it was a tragic and horrendous event. 2 cultures colliding and competing for the land and resources. But compared to the genocides that we mentioned before, it's quite small. But it was horrendous suffering. What about some of the other religions? Hindus. We mentioned the battles, the interreligious battles in Indian subcontinent between the Hindus and the Muslims. By and large, the Hindus came off worse. Then in Bangladesh, there were genocides in 1971. The Muslims sought to exterminate the Hindus who lived there, drive them out. Pakistan even today. Young girls, teenage girls who are not Muslims are being abducted. And roughly 1 Hindu girl per day, every year, is abducted, raped by a Muslim man, and forced to marry the Muslim rapist and to convert to Islam. It's a great way to expand the power of Islam and reduce Hinduism. That's horrendous. But if you look at Pakistan, and I'm using very conservative estimates here, for every Hindu girl that goes through that, 2 to 3 Christian girls are abducted and raped every day, forced to marry their rapist and to convert to Islam. Rape as a weapon of war is being used to expand religion. And in Islamic states in general, Hindus persistently are treated badly. What about the Buddhists? In Islamic states they have a pretty rough time. They also have some harassment at the hands of Hindus. But perhaps the greatest problems for Buddhists lie at the hands of totalitarian regimes, some of whom are communist, who seek to suppress all religion and all religious groups, seeing them as a threat. Other religions, by and large, other religions do get harassed in Islamic states. We've seen it in Syria. And there is intermittent harassment in various states, particularly totalitarian and communist states. But in looking at the persecution of other religions, while the story can be terrible and there's great suffering, remember that that added together is only 20% of the persecution in the world today. Again, that fact is often ignored in our modern media. Why is there this persecution? Why cannot human beings just treat each other with respect and tolerance? Simple reasons. And it all comes back to one word. When any religious or political group feels insecure, it will take steps to put down those that they perceive as a threat. Now, they may not be a threat at all, but perception is everything. So, for example, as the number of people following Jesus grows in most parts of the world, they're perceived as a threat. Because the power base of the ruling elite, or the ruling religious elite, that is perceived as being threatened. Now, the power base can be the power base of drug cartels in South America. It can be the power base of Islamic structures in the Middle East. It can be the power base of communist or totalitarian states. Or it can even be the power base of secular, irreligious Western cultures. In some countries there's a deliberate or religious policy of putting other groups down. There is no equality before the law in Islamic states for those who are not Muslims. That is built into Sharia law, it is built into Islamic law, and it stems right from the Quran. On and how we human beings love to enforce conformity. We tend to gravitate to the people who think as we think. And yet part of the excitement and richness of life is to mix and talk to people who don't think the same way as we think. And sometimes we discover that our cosy ways of thinking aren't quite as good as we first thought. But we try to impose conformity on others. Religious groups are particularly bad at that. So are some political groups. And then the followers of Jesus very often stand up for a certain level of ethics and morality. We've often failed in that. But many a follower of Jesus has ended up just eliminated because they resisted drugs trade, slave trade, the abuse of women, the abuse of money. Many have suffered horrendously because they won't follow on the ways of corruption that seem to be so endemic throughout the world. Reasons for abuse, there are some of them. But it all goes back to that insecurity. You see, we human beings, we love power. We love to be seen to be in control. And oh, how we make possessions a kind of God. Our materialistic West is one expression of that. But the idea of possessing land and controlling land and manning borders and keeping other people out, we love to do that. It's all over the world. And people in political and religious leaders, they love the power. And they love the feeling that they're in control of things. Insecurity is where it comes from. And very often we human beings use religion. We use it to gain power, control and possessions. And we use it to keep power, control and possessions. There is something of the history of persecution. And in today's world it's being directed particularly against the people of God, the followers of Jesus, many of whom are suffering horrendously in other countries. And it all stems back. Human beings, we're the ones at fault. And we have to include ourselves in that. We are at fault. And religion and politics is being used to abuse others.